New numbers from Statistics Canada show Canadians continue to shun travel to the United States. The data shows 1.4 million Canadians made return trips from the U.S. by car in October.
The federal government is playing hardball after two automakers dropped some Canadian car production. CBC News has learned it's limiting the number of tariff-free vehicles they can import from the United States.
A wave of uncertainty is moving through North America as an unexpected shift in Canadian spending begins to reshape the region's economic balance. A surge in tourism inside Canada has become a sign of a country pulling its money inward, while its closest neighbour struggles to understand the scale of the change. The latest national data revealed that tourism activity inside Canada climbed to $84 billion within 10 months. And the momentum behind that rise has carried a meaning that extends well beyond leisure. American visitor spending continued to fall, while Canadians showed a strong willingness to support their own industries. That behaviour reflects a deeper response to rising tariffs, tense political exchanges, and an atmosphere where cooperation feels increasingly fragile. When a population of nearly 40 million begins to change where its dollars flow, the impact reaches freight corridors, agriculture networks, manufacturing ties, and long-held assumptions about the direction of cross-border commerce. The stakes are growing with each new report, and the pattern forming beneath the headlines hints at a shift that could alter the economic relationship between both nations in ways few expected. Is this a brief reaction to political pressure or the start of a larger transformation? And if the trend continues, how far could its consequences spread across the continent? Canada is building a powerful internal economic momentum at a time when the United States is tightening tariffs and heightening the trade conflict. The newest data from global financial institutions released in October 2025 revealed a shift that caught many analysts off guard. The numbers show a country that is beginning to function with a level of independence rarely seen in its modern economic history. Canadian households, once viewed as heavily influenced by American demand, are now steering their purchasing power into domestic industries. This change carries weight because the long-held belief that Canadian growth rises in parallel with American consumer confidence no longer fits the reality emerging across provinces. While American households face slower spending and higher borrowing costs, Canadian consumption has steadily climbed. The difference between the two economies is now reshaping the movement of goods, the choices investors make, and the flow of services that once moved easily between both borders. Several provinces report rising activity in manufacturing, transportation, hospitality, and food services, sectors that had relied heavily on American buyers. Forecasts from Canadian economic agencies indicate that domestic consumption could account for more than 60% of national growth in 2026 if the current path continues. That projection reflects a level of internal reliance that economists have rarely seen in a country once deeply tied to American imports. This transformation is unfolding while the United States adopts a more aggressive tariff strategy. Higher duties on Canadian steel, electric vehicles, agricultural goods, and mineral components were intended to exert pressure on Ottawa during the trade confrontation. The result has gone in the opposite direction. Instead of returning to dependence on American goods, Canadians are buying domestic products or sourcing alternatives from Europe and Asia. Economists describe this as a permanent shift in consumer patterns that could be very difficult to reverse. As this pattern strengthens, the United States risks losing the leverage it has long used in economic negotiations. Another set of indicators is now beginning to surface, and these developments carry the potential to redefine the economic balance across the continent. The situation is no longer a subtle adjustment in spending habits. It has become the early phase of a broader break in the continental marketplace at a moment when the United States is highly vulnerable to another disruption. Recently, the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis released new findings that Washington had been trying to minimize for months. American export losses to Canada are expanding at a rate that analysts describe as deeply concerning. The sector showing the most severe impact is the automotive industry. For the first time in more than 2 decades, Canadian purchases of American-made vehicles dropped across all major categories. The decline includes trucks powered by gasoline, electric vehicles, and higher-end models. This fall in demand is not seasonal. It is the result of political tension, tariff battles, and a larger shift in consumer confidence. Executives in the American auto manufacturing belt have revived a term not seen in their reports since 2008. They are calling it a demand shock. Within their internal projections, even a 10% reduction in Canadian vehicle purchases could lead to widespread job losses, severe disruptions in supply chains, and new instability in plants already pressured by high operating costs. A drop twice that size is the scenario that causes the greatest anxiety in Washington. A shift of that scale could drive the American manufacturing sector into a crisis that would influence labor markets for years. The auto sector represents only the first industry facing this new reality. Agriculture is beginning to show early signs of strain as Canada expands imports from Europe and Asia. American wine and spirits producers report declines that exceed double digits. Retail companies along the border are preparing for lower traffic as Canadian consumers grow less willing to spend in the United States. During a trade war, the strongest force is often not a formal policy, but a collective adjustment in consumer behavior that grows quietly over time. Millions of Canadians are reshaping their spending patterns, and that movement cannot be reversed with speeches or temporary negotiations. The most troubling development spreading across North America is the way these changes are affecting everyday life in both countries. The shock is no longer confined to financial reports or government statistics. It has reached workers, business owners, and communities on both sides of the border. In Canada, the emphasis on domestic spending is creating a reinforcing cycle across the entire economy. Analysts at the OECD describe the effect as multi-layered and compounding. When Canadian households spend their money on local travel, Canadian-made products, or domestic services, the economic benefits remain in the country. That money supports restaurants, manufacturers, construction firms, repair shops, freight companies, and regional suppliers. Economists estimate that every dollar spent within Canada now produces significantly more than $1 of economic activity once the full chain of transactions is accounted for. This multiplier effect is helping create new jobs and revive regions that previously relied heavily on American shoppers and American-produced goods. Across the border, the story looks very different. American communities near Canada are experiencing falling retail activity, fewer hotel bookings, and weaker restaurant sales. The impact on the auto sector is particularly visible. Automakers are reducing overtime in major plants, and suppliers have begun slowing new hiring. Farmers in the United States who export fresh products to Canada worry that recently signed trade agreements between Ottawa and several international partners could permanently redirect demand away from American agriculture. These internal assessments describe a future that could alter the economic balance of the entire continent. Some of the predictions are so disruptive that they have not been released beyond small policy circles. Analysts warn that the United States may be facing a shift that is more consequential than anything revealed so far. What makes this moment so important for North America is the pace at which the global environment is rearranging itself around the region, reshaping alliances, redirecting capital, and shifting expectations about where the next decade of economic influence will come from. Canada is no longer waiting for the United States to reconsider its stance on tariffs or stabilize its trade agenda. Instead, Ottawa is moving with deliberate momentum toward a new set of commercial relationships that could redefine how business is conducted across the continent. Negotiators in Brussels and Canadian officials have revived long-pausing elements of the comprehensive economic and trade agreement, and updated forecasts released reveal major planned growth in Canadian automotive and agricultural exports heading toward Europe by the year 2027. European manufacturers, encouraged by Canada's calmer political climate and more dependable regulatory system, have begun pouring investment into Ontario's electric vehicle supply chain at volumes that signal a long-term commitment rather than a temporary response. What is becoming clearer with each new economic release is that Canada is not simply benefiting from temporary changes in consumer habits. The country is carrying out a long-term strategy meant to cushion its economy against political turbulence, tariff hikes, and the broad disruptions of any future trade conflict. Internal materials reviewed by several major policy institutes show a plan Canada has been shaping since the year 2022. That plan rests on a trio of coordinated objectives. The first involves strengthening domestic consumption so it functions as a stabilizer for growth. When households spend within the country, revenue circulates through national industries, tax collections increase, and the government gains stronger footing in international bargaining. This lowers exposure to sudden shifts, including those triggered by American decisions. The second objective focuses on expanding and diversifying supply chains with a scale and speed that has surprised many observers. Agreements that link Canada to the European Union, revived agricultural routes with Asia-Pacific partners, and China's renewed involvement in key Canadian sectors have already begun to reshape trade flows. For years, the United States assumed its northern neighbour would remain tied to American markets, but the recent developments weaken that assumption considerably. The third objective centres on reinforcing Canada's industrial capacity in essential fields, such as automotive production, critical minerals, clean energy, and food processing. Major investments in provinces like Ontario and Quebec show an ambition to build supply networks that can operate independently of unpredictable American tariffs or shifting policy priorities. If these networks manage to sustain themselves, Canada's economic position within North America could evolve in ways that lift it from a secondary role into something more autonomous. Canada's plan is advancing quickly, but the United States is confronting a threat that cannot be countered with tariff schedules or speeches. The threat is the quiet fading of automatic Canadian loyalty to American industries. For generations, Canadians supported American markets through routine choices. They bought American cars, traveled south for vacations, imported American products, and kept American supply chains busy even without incentives. This long-standing pattern generated billions of dollars for the United States and supported countless jobs. Once consumers shift their habits knowingly, reversing that shift becomes nearly impossible. A confidential warning circulating in Washington's economic circles describes this risk with growing urgency. If Canadian households continue turning toward domestic and international options, the United States could permanently lose a portion of its northern market regardless of which party controls Washington. The stakes are high because the consequences branch far beyond simple trade statistics. American factories rely on predictable Canadian demand for stability, and any reduction weakens their ability to operate efficiently. Farmers dependent on Canadian export contracts face the possibility that long-term agreements Canada signs with Europe or Asia could edge them out of the market. Retail chains near the border that once counted on Canadian shoppers may see fewer customers. Tourism in northern states could decline as Canadian travellers stay home or choose destinations abroad. All of these changes accumulate, undermining an economic relationship that has shaped political and commercial ties for more than half a century. North America is stepping into a period defined by unpredictable forces. Treaties and formal agreements still matter, but they no longer dictate the economic landscape as sharply as the choices made by millions of consumers responding to new incentives, new uncertainties, and new opportunities. Canada's move towards stronger internal spending, wider global partnerships, and reduced reliance on American supply chains has evolved far beyond theory. It has become a tangible set of outcomes reflected in trade balances, investment flows, and shifting competitive advantages. The United States, weighed down by rising tariffs, softer household demand, and tougher competition from Europe and Asia, now confronts a strategic challenge that will require more than rhetoric to address. The influence that shaped the region for decades is tilting, and the direction of that tilt will be determined by decisions unfolding right now. Whether this shift turns into a temporary response to global tension or solidifies into a long-term restructuring depends on governments, corporate leaders, and everyday consumers whose choices accumulate into patterns stronger than policy announcements. The future of North American trade is moving toward a crossroads that demands close attention. What do you think about all this? Tell us in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel for more and turn on notifications. See you in the next one.